Hello and welcome back to the Argyle Martech Leadership Forum, Smarter Tech for Marketing Success. My name is Michael with Argyle, and it's great to have everyone joining us today. I have some important information to share with you, and then we'll turn the floor over to our esteemed keynote speaker. First, a quick reminder to stop by our sponsors' virtual booths at any time during today's event and for the following week. Our partners are committed to providing you with valuable content and a great overall experience. To ask questions throughout the session, simply type into the Q&A chat and we will address your questions at the end of the session. And now, without further delay, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Adrian Foley, Vice President of Marketing, First On-Site Property Restoration. We're excited to have Adrian for his keynote presentation titled, Tell Me a Story, Building Your Martech Stack Around Storytelling. Adrian, thank you so much for being here today. Welcome, and over to you.
Thanks a lot, Michael. And Lindsay, thank you. And Eric, who's out there in the ether somewhere, everybody at Argyle for including me in today's session. It's been pretty exciting, and I'm extremely excited to share this information with you. So I want to start this keynote session by telling you a story. A couple of months ago, I attended a Stanford Graduate School of Business course for CMOs. And on day one, they had our class doing rapid bonding exercises to quickly get to know each other. Some of you, or maybe all of you, have been through something like this, I'm sure, where you do some improv games and different things to quickly get to know the group in your class so that the next 5 or 10 days, you become fast friends really quickly. At one point during the rapid bonding, I was paired up with Pons Pandakuthra. You can see here in the picture, he's the more handsome guy in the orange jacket. And Pons is the global CMO at Nissan. And our exercise at that moment was to pretend that we had been friends for years and to discuss an important memory from our years of friendship. Well, it turns out Pons and I were pretty good at pretending to be lifelong friends, and it was really a fun way to get to know each other. After the exercise, Pons and I were talking about motorcycles. This is a personal passion of his. It's something I'm deathly afraid to get on, but it was a great conversation. But something suddenly happened that changed the course of that conversation I want to tell you about. Now, before I get into that, you should know that Pons was born and raised in rural India. And I was born and raised in the suburbs of Chicago, in Des Plaines, Illinois, specifically. And you really couldn't find a more unlikely pair to match up at this event. When Pons, though, discovered I was from Des Plaines, he proceeded to tell me the following story that blew my mind. When Pons was a boy, his family lived on a rural farm in India. They were farmers, and this was your, of course, typical backbreaking work. It was often beyond hot and muggy and dirty and grimy and dusty. There was little escape from the oppressive elements of nature. And as farmers, they didn't see many other people in the regular course of their lives unless they traveled into the city, and they rarely had visitors. But one summer evening, as the sun was setting, sound of the evening crickets was growing louder, and Pons and his dad were wrapping up the farm work for the day, all sweaty, ready for a shower and to eat dinner. Out of the blue, across the field, at the other end of their farm, 2 young men with giant, heavy backpacks appeared. Now, as the men approached Pons's home, crossing that farm, Pons saw his father first stiffen into sort of a defensive posture. Never before had 2 men just shown up on their farm unannounced. For a brief moment, Pons feared that they were actually there maybe to do harm to the family. I mean, his father became really stiff. Father, by the way, normally a stoic guy and rarely showed fear. This moment, Pons saw fear in his father's eyes. As the 2 men approached, his father picked up a shovel and began walking out to meet them. Pons, as an 8-year-old, Pons just thought, hey, they're here to do our family harm. My dad's going to go defend the family, and I'm going to go with. But with a single gesture of his hand, his father directed Pons to stay back. Over the next couple of minutes, Pons stood there frozen and watched as the 2 parties met in the middle of that farm. They talked for a few minutes. Pons couldn't hear what they were saying. And after a few minutes, he saw his father reach out his hand, and the men shake the hand, and they all turned to come back toward the house. And he knew, okay, it's not bad news. Well, it turns out it wasn't bad news. That these 2 men were simply backpackers from the United States, backpacking through India, and they had gotten lost. They were tired, they were weary, they were hungry, they were haggard and humbled by having gotten lost. And they slumped over and dropped their heavy backpacks in the dirt when they got to the house. And they asked if Pons's family might be willing to take them in for one night so they could rest up. Family didn't hesitate. Pons's dad, his mom, they brought them in, they fed them, they helped them to understand where they were, how to get back on their journey properly. And what happened was the men ended up staying for a couple of days. And during that time, they regaled Pons and the family with their stories of America. The two men were, you probably guessed it by now, they were from Des Plaines, Illinois. And they told Pons and his family all about what life was like in Des Plaines, living in a Chicago suburb and the United States in particular. Now, prior to this point in his life, Pons had never met an American, let alone someone from the Chicagoland area. And after a couple of days, the men continued on their way and left off to continue their journey, and Pons never saw them again. But these stories from Des Plaines, Illinois, stuck with Pons for years. They made such an impression on Pons that exactly 10 years later, when he was 18, he decided to leave the family farm, travel to the US and go to college. And he ended up in the Midwest, not Des Plaines, but he ended up in Iowa, where he fell in love with the American culture and the American dream. Pons, this little Indian kid from rural India, farm boy, went on to a stellar marketing career, rising in the ranks of several big companies, and finally to his current role as the global head of marketing at Nissan. He's an inspiration to me and many others in business for sure. The way that this kid who knew nothing about marketing or business was able to be so successful. You can imagine how it felt in that moment, hearing his story, how impactful that felt for me personally. How connected I instantly became with Pons simply through a relevant short story about his youth. I mentioned this to Pons, and we talked about it a lot, and how it made me feel. And he said, yeah, and you know what, Adrian? That's the problem with most marketers these days. They don't know story. My talk today is about story, because as much fun as Martech can be to write and talk and think about, it's really only a delivery device for your story. As you think about your Martech stack or the one you want to build, you need to first think about what are the stories you want to tell. And then from there, determine what technologies are best for delivering those stories. And that's because storytelling is the seed that every other marketing activity grows from. If your customers don't find your story engaging and persuasive, they may not be your customers much longer or at all. So for that reason, today I'm going to honor my friend Pons and his story and cover these following topics: the power of story, story structure, the elements of story, why marketers sometimes struggle with story, and then we'll sum it up with some interesting last thoughts. Okay, let's go back 64,000 years ago, maybe even longer, to the oldest story ever told that anthropologists have been able to discover. And that's this image you see here, which they call the red hand stencil. It's in Maltraveso Cave, the cave in Caceres, Spain. And like I said, it's over 64,000 years old. It was created by Neanderthals, and it is known as the oldest cave painting known to man. And anthropologists believe that cave paintings of hands in particular, and this is the first one, the oldest one, but there's many other hand paintings in caves, especially hand paintings that have missing fingers or severed fingers, are actually showing a story. They're sign language, telling a story about hunting or passing information along to others about the hunting or silent rituals. Here's another cave painting. This is a little bit more recent. It's almost 44,000 years old. And in this one, you see a depiction of a pig hunt. This cave painting is known by anthropologists as the oldest pictorial record of storytelling and the earliest figurative artwork in the world. So yes, stories are powerful. And now I think they appear to be even embedded in our DNA as a way to communicate with each other. But you have to ask yourself, and I often do, why are stories powerful? Stanford marketing professor and author Jennifer Acker explains that stories are powerful because they have these three key elements. They're memorable, they're impactful, and they're personal. So now think about those from a marketing standpoint. Memorable, impactful, and personal. Maybe you have had these conversations with your teams. You know, what's our differentiator? How do we make our brand or our product or service more memorable? Maybe you've asked this question: how can we have more of an impact on our audience? Or how can we have an impact at all on our audience? How can we inspire them to feel something or take actions? And something we hear a lot about now, was talked about earlier in this session today, a personalization, being personal, and how can we connect in a more personal way with our audience? How do we make that experience they feel more personalized? Or as I hear a lot now in the account-based marketing technology arena, phrases like this: our ABM technology allows you to create personalized experiences at scale. But how do we know stories are powerful? Well, of course, as I just mentioned, in some cases it's obvious. In marketing, it can be obvious. We tell a great story. Maybe it's across social or PR, it's a commercial, whatever. And we can then measure the results. We look at performance results. So that says, yeah, that was an impactful story. That's a powerful story. We blasted through our KPI goals. But there's actual research around the impact of story that scientifically proves that story has an impact. This is one great research study that I love and I wanted to share with you today. In 2009, a literary and sort of quasi-anthropological experiment devised by Rob Walker and Josh Glenn called Significant Objects was conducted to test their hypothesis that narrative transforms insignificant objects into significant ones. I'm going to repeat that. Narrative transforms insignificant objects into significant ones. So what was this experiment? Well, they got 200 trinkets. They purchased 200 little tchotchke trinkets like the ones you see here on the screen, not more than a few dollars each, from thrift stores and garage sales. And then they invited 100 authors, some famous, some not so famous, to come in and write fictional stories, giving these little tchotchkes, giving them significance. And instantly, an unremarkable sort of cast-off thingamajig suddenly becomes a significant object because now it has a story. Each of these objects was listed for sale on eBay. You can see 3 that were listed here: a star can, a little cow creamer, and a Ziggy button, or a Ziggy heart thing. And these are all, of course, insignificant objects. So they're listed on eBay, and below the picture on eBay, instead of a factual description, the object's newly written fictional story was used. So here's an example of one of them. And when you get the slides after this conference, take a read of this story. It's by Helen DeWitt, the author of The Last Samurai. And it's really funny and really deep and poignant. And it tells the story about this SARS mask that she found when she was in Japan. And care was, of course, taken by the researchers to let the audience know, or let the eBayers know, this was a fictional story. They weren't trying to hide that at all. And so they posted the author's byline below. So let's see, what were the results of this significant objects experiment? Well, they ended up selling $128.74 worth of junk for $3,612.51. So that's an over 2,700% increase in value, simply because they added the story. I feel their hypothesis was correct. And then what they said after the experiment was completed, and they went on and did a bunch of experiments like these that all confirmed the same outcome, that stories are such a powerful driver of emotional value that their effect on any given subject value can actually be measured objectively. And stories are. They are a powerful driver of emotional value. Okay, let's get into structure. As Carolyn Lawrence, she's a really famous children's novel author, she points out, every story needs structure, just as every body needs a skeleton. It's how you flesh out and clothe your structure that makes each story unique. And like story itself, story structure also seems to be somehow embedded in our human DNA. There's a reason why we tell the same stories over and over and over. They work, but why do they work? And why do we tell the same ones all the time? I'll give you one quick example. The great biblical flood story, Noah's Ark. Some of you may know of that. Maybe all of you are really well familiar with it. That was told at least 3 times prior to the Christian version. There was a Noah's Ark story in Sumeria, and there was one in ancient Greece. Same story, same structure, just slightly tweaked for cultural nuances. The great authors and playwrights and screenwriters of the world have figured all of this out, obviously, and they adhere to really strong certain structures, and there's several structures, in fact. And by the way, there's some that believe there's only a certain finite amount of structures for storytelling. When we look at the book by Christopher Booker, it's called The 7 Basic Plots, Why We Tell Stories. He puts out this bold theory that there's only 7 stories that are, or 7 plots that we ever tell. These are the 7 that he lists: Overcoming the Monster, Rags to Riches, The Quest, Voyage and Return, Comedy, Tragedy, and Rebirth. Some have argued there's more, some have argued there's less, but the point of this is that these exist, and these archetypal plot lines exist because we can relate to them. They somehow touch us as human beings. And in each of these stories, there are individual characters that play a huge role in the development to how the chapter in your personal story plays out. So I ask you, have you ever met that wise stranger that gave you sagely advice out of nowhere just when you needed it? Or you found an unlikely ally that helped you overcome some odds? Well, guess what? Your customers are going through one of these plot lines at this very moment. Which one is it? And how are you, what role are you going to play in their story? So I'll give you a quick example. Overcoming the Monster, the first plot line. These stories are pretty obvious. The hero, your customer, must destroy the monster to balance out the world. Now, in the real world, this could be overcoming an addiction, overcoming debt, beating an illness, or anything that requires something to be defeated for your customer, the hero, to win. Now, if your product or service falls into this category, then you need to look, what is the role that we play? Are we playing the sidekick in this customer story? And we stick with them to the very end? Or is the role that we're actually the weapon? We're the lightsaber that will deliver the final blow. Oops. The sentiment of this hero or your customer at the center of the story, of course, many of you are probably familiar with that. It's been echoed through many, many writers and books and ideas throughout marketing. The most famous writer, of course, to talk about this concept was Joseph Campbell. And he claimed that these stories, many of these stories are really fall into mythical structures or myth-based. He called this mythical structure the hero's journey, and he mapped out the 12 stages that your customer or hero go through on their journey. And I'll just give you a quick overview. The hero starts in the known world. They travel to the unknown world, all the way down the rabbit hole to the abyss, where it's life and death stakes, and they defeat the monster, they kill the bad guy, or whatever it is. They overcome the obstacle, and they travel back to the known world. But they travel back changed. Now there is and changed and better, obviously, for it, smarter. There is a shorter version of this we use a lot in marketing. Again, you may be familiar, maybe not, maybe helpful to you. And it only has 5 stages. And the first stage is called the platform. It's similar to the known world. And basically, this is just really a few sentences or ideas to set up the story. Who is your hero and where is your hero? The second stage is the tilt, and this is, of course, the inciting incident. This is what causes the journey to begin. It's the problem your hero faces. The third is the cascading events. This is where the hero goes through a series of events that continue him or her to spiral downward toward that abyss. And eventually they get to the bottom and reach the climax or change. And this is the moment where the hero defeats his or her enemy or conquers the dragon or whatever it may be and becomes changed for the better. And finally, the hero journeys back to the known world again, but this is now a new reality because the hero has been changed for the better. He or she is stronger, they're wiser, whatever the case may be. And remember, it's the change part of this whole structure, same with Campbell's, it's a change that is the key. Because if there is no change to your story, to your hero's journey, your story is not a story, it's an anecdote. I'll repeat that really quick. If there is no change for your hero, your story is not a story, it's an anecdote. Once you learn to recognize this pattern, you'll begin to see it everywhere in marketing. That's because it appeals to the most basic way we as people process information. Think about your marketing funnel. What's the story you tell to get them in the funnel? What's the story you tell at the top of the funnel? What's the one in the middle of the funnel? Maybe it's the same story, but just different chapters. Some of you may be thinking, okay, well, all right, I get this, Adrian. It's good. The story structure is right, good for an article, but this doesn't apply to an Instagram post. Yes, it does. It applies to an Instagram post. It applies to the how-tos, the listicles, thought leadership pieces, everything that we do. They may not make literal sense, but it does apply. And when you apply a storytelling structure, your content will be much better because of it. And it's because of the power of story in creating messages. It's universal. The most basic building blocks of story structure are elements designed to capture and keep our attention, to acquire and retain customers. This is the structure of audience engagement. So once you understand this and how you work, you can storyfy anything. Okay, really quickly, all great stories have two specific things. They have detail and they have dramatic technique. You can see here the detail. There's 4 categories for detail. It's visual, auditory, kinesthetic, and digital. The visual, of course, is the image. So whether that's a literal image or it's the image that's painted for the customer in their minds. Think about the story I told about Ponds at the start of this. Did you get that visual of his childhood farm and what that felt like and what it looked like? The auditory, of course, is what you hear in the story. It's either literally what you hear, if it's an audio piece or video, or what is described to you. Now, did you hear the sound of those crickets growing louder on Pons' farm as the sun set? The kinesthetic is the physical elements like movement and such. You know, the backpackers putting down their heavy backpacks, the father and them meeting in the middle of the farm. And then lastly, digital. These are numbers, statistics, data. How many years was, how old was Pons when he went to college? How old was he on the farm? You may remember that data from the story. And then the 4 main forms of dramatic technique. This is how we tell the story. So you have to have these detail in the story to make it great, and you have to tell it in a certain way. You might tell it with a surprise element, like the 2 weary travelers arriving to Pons' farm. You might have some suspense. This is referring to an emotional process where there's an unknown situation, event, or threat that produces anxiety, like when Pons was looking at his father. Mystery, which sometimes gets mistaken for suspense. This really refers to an intellectual process where there's a puzzle that needs to be solved. And lastly, the secret. This is when the storyteller or a character in the story holds something back that either other characters don't know, or the audience or the readers don't know. Now, all these things, again, like work together, as I said, and as we look at how we tell our stories, whether it's comms, external comms, blog posts, whatever, we need to always ask ourselves, do we have detail? And what is our dramatic technique? Knowing that, looks we have 5 minutes left. Okay, I'm going to try and jam through this, guys. Sorry. Knowing that we know what we know about power and story and the humans, and that humans have been telling these stories for tens of thousands of years, how is it that it sometimes can be so hard for us to tell great stories? And I believe there are many reasons for this, but the one that's most relevant to us today is time, or more precisely, the lack of unstructured time. Because that's because creative thinking flourishes in unstructured time. This is the opportunity for the mind to rest and replenish. And if you ever have that opportunity to unplug from the grid, put your devices away and just sit or do something with no devices at all for 20 minutes, just do nothing. Ideas will start to flow. I go on a hike every Sunday morning for this very reason, and I get my best creative ideas on that hike because I'm not plugged in. As technology advances, so does our required connection to it, and the connection causes the loss of unstructured time. I'll just give you a quick fact. When the telegraph first came out in the 1800s, it allowed people to communicate across vast distances at 3 bits per second. When the internet came out in 85 to the public, it could now allow people to communicate at 1,000 bits per second. The internet we have now is over 1 billion bits per second. Communications are becoming faster and faster. So we have to have this connection to the grid. It's deeper and deeper. And each of us are being driven by this artificial urgency of the world around us. And time becomes more fractured, more frantic, and more structured. So that need for connection grows, and the need for unstructured time disappears. How many times have you had this happen? You guys show up for, you and your staff show up for some kind of meeting. It's a creative meeting or a brainstorm or something like that. The first thing everyone does is take their phone out and put it on the table. They're kind of like oxygen tanks for emphysemas. We got to be connected. Okay. When you understand that storytelling is the seed from which all other marketing activities grow, then the answer to this question should be really simple. Why do you use MarTech? When I ask marketers this, I often hear things like, well, to encourage customers or engage customers, acquire, retain, analyze performance, whatever those terms are. And they're all true to some regards. But when you go back to the question and you realize, oh, wait, that's not what he's asking. Why do you use MarTech? The actual answer is, I use MarTech to help tell my story. So lastly, I want to implore you to consider the following 3 discussed items today as you work to build your MarTech stack. Okay, you and your teams, go back, refresh, learn the basics of storytelling. That's what we do in marketing. Chief marketing officers, chief marketing technologists. There's got to be a title, chief marketing storyteller, because that's the heart of marketing. Identify your customer story, consider them the hero, and then discover what your role in their hero's journey is. What role is your brand, product, or service play for them? And lastly, create opportunities for you and your team to have unstructured time so creativity can rise. Unplug without a plan or agenda, and your stories will be better for it. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrian. It's a wonderful presentation. Now, as a reminder, audience members can still enter questions, and we're going to review some of the ones that came through. Okay, our first question. Being in a digital world today where everyone's time and attention is divided can be challenging at times. How do you keep your audience's attention when telling a story?
Well, for the same reason you need to unplug and be unstructured, the reverse is true. You need to keep them connected and you need to capture their attention. If you go through the structure of storytelling and you look at that first few things, whether it's the inciting incident or it's even just the few words you say or even the image in an Instagram post, it has to be something that captures them right away. And that's something you're going to find as you test, whether you A/B test or you just look at performance analytics, you'll see what works. Human face, obviously, in images is the #1 thing people click on, still true to this day. That's a good place to start.
Excellent. Our next question is, what skill sets does one need to go from data to a powerful connecting story?
That's a great question, probably asked by someone who's really great with data, which I get because our whole team is great with data. There's 2 ways to look at it. First off, data is only a snapshot of the past. It is not forward-looking. It's just looking at what is right now or in the past. You have to tell that story. You have to surmise the story from the data for the future. So you look at data sometimes as the story of your activities, your marketing activities. But it's only part of the story. You have to inject yourself. So skill set wise is go out, pick up a couple books about storytelling, learn storytelling. It's not hard. It's very simple. It's hard to master, I guess, especially in the marketing sense of storytelling, but the data can help you create a structure for your story, right? We sent out this ad. It got X amount of clicks. It did this much in revenue, et cetera, et cetera. Then we sent this one out, blah, blah, blah. Maybe you made a change. Maybe you A/B tested and changed a line of copy or you changed the image and you start to learn from the data that you receive what the story is. But the key here, you have to look at it as a story being told to you, not as data.
Excellent, thank you. Our next question, what steps should one consider when building a story for our organization?
For the organization, that's a great question because that's the most important story. And that story, by the way, has to be told internally first. One of the big problems I've encountered over and over through companies I've worked with is the story of what is our organization is not consistent in everybody's mind. The entire group, the employees, everybody has to be consistent with what is our story. And that's on marketing to build. You work with CEO and you work with leadership, but you have to build that story. What is your company's story? Many things are to be considered. What's the product? What's the service? What are we doing here? What's our goals? You have to kind of look at all of it from a business standpoint. Lay all that data out on a big board like this one or with a group and start to pull the main key elements of your story out of that data. Well, okay, we are technology, we're SaaS. Okay. Got it. Who's our CIOs are our customers? Okay, got that. Okay, what's the next piece of that story? Our culture, maybe. What kind of people are we? we all seem to get along? Are we all this kind of people or what? And you kind of build your story in those steps. Happy to, if someone, I don't know if we can do this, but want to reach out, I can help them do that too.
Thank you, Adrian. We can definitely connect you with those questions. And I'm afraid that's all the time we have for today. I appreciate this was a wonderful presentation. I also want to thank everyone for joining us today for this fantastic keynote. Now, this session, along with all of today's content, will be available on demand following the event. Adrian, thank you so much.
Thanks, Michael. Appreciate it. Thanks, everyone.